Hello, my name is Alex Gwynn. I'm a graphic designer and paper engineer with a decade of experience designing paper toys and papercraft. And in today's video, we're going to be looking at Cutzilla. And we're going to also be looking at Cutzilla. It's the same toy, 11 years apart, but we'll get into all that. So to start with, let's start building this version of Cutzilla. Now, Cutzilla was designed and released by Luke Glood in 2009, so 11 years ago. And then 11 years after they designed and released this toy, they have come back to the paper toy scene, fallen back in love with paper engineering, and released an updated version of their design that's called Refolded. Now that's interesting for a couple of reasons. Mostly just to see how a designer takes on the same character with an additional 11 years of expertise, of knowledge on the subject. That's not to say that Luke has spent the last 11 years designing paper toys. They've taken a break in that time. But now they've come back and they've designed a really, really nice paper toy. So I thought it would be exciting to look at the old design, look at the new design, and compare the two. Now, this old Cutzilla design you can see here, it has like Bart Simpsoning between the fingers, which means a lot of acute angles really close to each other. And these are always really awkward to cut out, because you can sit there and do it with a pair of scissors, and in general, if you're trying to save time, you can, snip all the left side and then snip all the right side. But the problem with that is scissors have a tendency to overcut. They continue into the cut by a millimeter or so, and that can become really noticeable when there's a lot of them right next to each other. So I found the best way to cut out things like this, things like a lot of fingers or a lot of toes, is just with a craft knife, and it just takes a little while. Now, I first met Luke and interacted with them on Nice Paper Toys, which was a very popular paper toy forum back in the day, and we were part of a group called the Chatting Collaborators. It was myself, Zakine from Just Us, and Ross Hendry, who released toys like I think it was called Cap. Luke released Cutzilla as probably their most noticeable and notable paper toy. And I remember just being really excited with the Chatting Collaborators. It was effectively just a bunch of kids on the internet talking to each other, and I remember the big novelty of it was just talking to people from around the globe. I believe Zakine from Just Us was based in Singapore, and I never spoken to someone from Singapore before. This was one of my first interactions with someone across the globe using the internet. Now, of course, we take that for granted. During lockdown especially, we're talking to people from all around the globe over the internet, and it's just the norm. Like on paper toy discords, we just take it for granted that we're talking to people from all around the world. But I remember at the time this was a new thing for me and very, very exciting. And we organised all of our events just on this paper toy website's instant chat section, and that's where we'd hang out. Now, for the sake of a full disclosure here, I'm not entirely separated from this Cutzilla project. As you'll see when we get into the updated design, I did have a bit of feedback for Luke and was vaguely involved in the tabbing and things, but it's still 100% their design. But that said, I am hosting the Cutzilla files on my website, just because I'm excited to get this paper toy out there, and if I could help out with some hosting, I would. But bear that in mind, I might be slightly biased for reasons you will see as to my rating of this design. Okay, so now I've folded over all the various sections of this old 2009 Cutzilla template, and if I press, check this out, this is a fancy bit of tech right here. If I press this button, I switch cameras, because making the other camera focus took forever. In fact, there you can see the latency. So I set up another camera to do close-ups that's better at focusing, although it is strobing a little bit. So now that I've folded the designs, you can start to see some of the limitations of Luke's work at the time. For example, this tail tab, the tabs, instead of being on the top of this tail section here, that on the sides of the tail, so when the tabs come to meet, as you can see, the tab is actually overhanging outside of the tail, so I'm going to have to cut those short. So that tab's actually wrong, and I have a sneaking suspicion that this inner jaw section, let's switch back, that this inner jaw section here is going to be mathematically incorrect. But that's pretty much what you'd expect for a toy from 2009. I think we take for granted how far paper toys have come in that time and what elements have been normalised in terms of paper toy design. Now this design uses foldovers for the arms, meaning that you apply glue to the back of the page and then fold them over on themselves so that there is texture on both sides of the element. But interestingly, one of the more unique features of Cutzilla, here on the horns of the Zilla, they don't have a fold over, and that's because they're white, meaning that there's no need for a fold over section because it would just be white anyway. Now that can cause some issues with customization, because if someone wants to make those horns a different colour, the lack of a fold over there means that there's going to be no texture. I'm really having to pull this piece to get this edge correct. You can see that to pull it back all the way down here, it's actually straining the page in the corner. I don't know if that comes across. But what that means is that this is actually not mathematically correct. Like, these two faces don't actually meet up perfectly. But that's not all that surprising, if I'm honest. This isn't going to be the purpose of this video isn't to dunk on Luke's old design. So when I point out a flaw with this Cutzilla design, this 2009 version, it's not to kind of mock or just for the sake of pointing out the flaws. It's to show how far they've come with the new design. Okay, yeah, that's what you can see here. If I move this arm out of the way, this side face slightly curves, and that's because if you imagine this from the top, this right angle here effectively causes the page to be under stress and bend. You can see on the inside here, if I flip it round, I could do with another light just behind that camera because it's quite dark in there. But even though I've trimmed down these tabs so that they fit within the tail section, that means they're overlapping each other on the inside, which makes it quite difficult to get a consistent surface and apply pressure to it, meaning that it's difficult to glue. See how far off these tabs are? So when I pull this inner face here, you can see it doesn't even come across on camera all that well. But it's probably 3-4 millimeters too long. The face doesn't really match up at all. And now 3-4 millimeters, I know that doesn't sound like much. But let me see if I can get this to come into focus, which is always a challenge with this this setup. Come on. There. So you can see it extends past that fold line by just a teeny tiny amount, and it doesn't seem like a lot at all. But then when we go to fold this face down, you see that it kind of lifts it up. It makes it buckle, and as you can see, this kind of front piece of card starts tearing away from the edge, because now the internal section is being forced forwards and at a different rate to this kind of top layer of the card. So that causes this divot and this corner to kick off at the end there. We do take for granted today that paper toys will line up to such an exact degree. But that wasn't always the way. If you look for a lot of older designs, especially from, before 2010, they're off by significant amounts. And there's a lot of designs by not just designers like Luke, but better known designers. I think part of the reason it was more common back then is just because it was more amateur back then, which is not to say that's a bad thing. I think I actually prefer a lot of toys from that era because they're just pure design, if that makes sense. It wasn't that people were focusing on the paper engineering aspect of it so much. They just had an idea, they wanted to make a toy, they had access to paper, and that was it. They were off. Oh, I should probably glue this down later, actually. That's another thing. None of the tabs are are numbered. You see that front corner there? It's a bit messy. Like, measurements were wrong all the time. Tabs were never numbered. It was just the norm. And I guess that's the main focus of today's video. Building these designs is what was the norm in 2009. What's the norm today? I've glued myself into a corner because the tabs aren't numbered. I don't even... There we go. If I kind of push really hard, I can just kind of jam it all together and hope that it sticks. I think there is a purity to those old toys that weren't so focused on the paper engineering. They were just, hey, I want to make a toy. Here's my attempt at making a toy. And it's because they're not through a professional lens. They're not through a lens of people who had designed hundreds of toys. I think I think that sometimes the charm of paper toys is lost today because those who are still making them know what they're doing, if that makes sense. It's like the charm of the original 150 Pokemon. A lot of that charm is because they were placeholders by programmers, not by designers. And it was only later that a designer, an artist, was brought in to kind of fix up those designs, get rid of some of the more ugly ones, alter them and come up with new characters, which is why the original Pokemon set is so inconsistent. But you compare that to the new Pokemon and they almost feel too polished sometimes, too much like the people who were making them knew what they were doing. And I do worry sometimes that my own designs are missing out on that charm. Now, to connect the head to the body, it's just two flat faces meeting. Now, personally, I try and avoid this where possible because it can be difficult. It's one of those things that is really easy as a design solution. It's, well, you stick the two blocks together, and it feels like that should be the norm. However, there are problems that come with that. One of them being you just kind of have to apply a lot of glue, which can make the page warp. If there's any page warping ever, trying to get two flat surfaces to push together can be difficult. And on top of that, because you're effectively dealing with two objects that are made of paper, asking someone to apply a pressure to it, and I know for a fact the new Cutzilla design has the same technique, so it'll be interesting to see how different it is. These legs are interesting in themselves. They're just little rectangular prisms, little cuboids, but there's nothing stopping them just wobbling from side to side. You can see I can just flatten them, and you might think, oh yes, but when they're stuck in place that won't be an issue. But there's nothing connecting the other side. You've glued to this surface here, surprisingly, the one marked glue, and even if we hold that still, the other three faces can just wiggle all they want, and there's nothing stopping them. And also, let's do it now rather than just me explaining it. Let's glue this in and show you what I mean. When you go to glue these legs in, I think it's this leg. Where's that side? See, I cut off the piece of paper that tells you which leg is which. I think it's that leg. Or is it the other leg? Is it that leg? Okay, I think it's that leg. You can see even then, it doesn't say where to glue it. It just says glue. You're kind of just left up to your own devices. There's nothing locking it into a specific position, which again is something we just take for granted now. So many old toys were just made of various paper blocks, and then you just had to glue them together. But there was nothing that really stopped you from misaligning pieces. There was nothing necessarily telling you exactly where to place it. In fact, I think I've now made an error, because will the other leg even fit there? Oh, it will, just. And it's not like this was, although this design has some flaws, it was by no means regarded as a bad design. It was customized by a bunch of artists because it was just seen, people didn't think it had these flaws at the time. You wouldn't really see people complaining about these things. Oh no, I'm gluing this wrong. You can see I'm struggling to stick this last leg on. because if I try and apply pressure to it, it moves. The blank version of this design was customized by a bunch of different artists. Morgan Gleaves did a custom, Zakine, also known as Just Us, did a custom, Daydream Kid, Schnopel Studio, Ross Hendry, Vinzart, Painkiller, CJ, and Super Cooper, as well as myself, all made customs of this design. And I don't think a single person pointed out any of the issues that I've probably pointed out in this video. And that's because in 2009 they were not considered issues. Okay, so here we go. Let's swap over. Here is Cutzilla, a really simple model, just a few nicely shaped blocks stuck together. A lot of mathematical inconsistencies. You can see here that the face kind of warps towards the snout. It suddenly cuts off and goes in, and that's because this inner jaw section that kind of covers the top of the mouth, an area that realistically most people will never see, doesn't actually fit there. It kind of forces the front of this page to pull inwards, which puts the whole thing under a lot of pressure, but nevertheless a very charming toy. So now let's build the new version, the Refolded edition of Cutzilla, and see how the designs differ. The new Cutzilla is 3 pieces, technically 2 and a butterfly. It still has the same Bart Simpsoning around the fingers and toes, but already, I'm sure just by looking at a flat template, you can see how different this new design is. And the reason I'm so excited about this new design, and one of the reasons I really wanted to share it with everyone, is because a lot of design elements that I've been trying to normalize for the last 10 years are implemented in this design. Not to toot my own little horn or anything, but I know that my designs were somewhat of an inspiration to Luke for this rebuild, this recut version of the design. And it's really exciting to see these things that I've been trying to just make as a standard are kind of taking hold as some form of standard. So things like having numbered tabs as the default, things like having bleed, the design has a nice little bleed around the edge, things like having tabs continue the texture that is beneath them is the norm. There are tabs that are on top. I guess what would they be called? Reversed tabs? So for example, this nose section here, tab 8 is this flap, but the actual tab is beneath it. So inverted tabs is what we'll call them, being used as the norm. Now, you will struggle in older toys to find any inverted tabs, especially from around 2009, 2010. The closest you got were things like we saw on this design where 2 blocks would meet and be glued together. And even then that's where pieces meet, not necessarily a flipped tab or an inverted tab. Things like slot tabs, these legs are slot tabs where they lock into position without the use of glue because another face meets somewhere else. And if those faces meet, it means the other face can't move if there's a piece extending beyond it, which is what these are, which say tuck inside. Things like the tab markings being smaller than the tab where they connect, so they have effectively got a textured bleed. That's just on here. A bunch of design elements that I've slowly just made the standard in all of my designs because I think they improve the design and, more importantly, the building process. It's really excited to see those implemented in other people's designs. And I'm hoping that this indicates to some extent that the new normal for paper toys is using these design elements, these things. And that's not to say like I've normalized this is how it should be. But I think that even if I hadn't designed any paper toys, I never got involved in paper toys, I think eventually these same design elements would come to the forefront as a standardization, as the new normal. Because in retrospect, you think, yeah, it's weird that this toy had all those tabs and none of them were numbered. It's weird that the tabs didn't actually fit inside the faces they attached to. It's weird that they involve gluing tabs on top of other tabs. It's weird that like these elements don't technically fit together. And it's weird that certain tabs are close-faced, meaning that there's, like for example, when I was gluing the top of this roof, the mouth roof together, I couldn't actually get to any of those tabs to glue them in because I'd glued this tab down before. So there was no way for me to physically get in there. Whereas if they were reverse tabs, if they had the tab on the outside, it wouldn't be a problem. I think all of these things are just the natural progression of this art form, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to share this model with everyone. That, and it's just a really nice model. Okay, so we've cut these Bart Simpsoning elements, the toes and the hands, which I guess is a nice carryover from the original. And now we can start folding things over and gluing them together. And another thing I've just spotted that I meant to mention, this piece here that says Cutzilla on it, this folds over onto tab 11 and makes a bottom face. Now this serves two purposes. One of them is it gives a nice space for the logo, but more importantly, this stabilizes and locks in place this back element, which in turn locks in place all the other faces on the bottom section. The paper wants to kind of unfold itself, and so it will bulge outwards. And this design would definitely have fallen victim to that. So it's really good to see that bottom face added. It's also worth noting just how nice the texture on this is. It's kind of this crayon-y, pencilish texture, kind of almost painterly. It's somewhat reminiscent of Matt Hawkins' newer designs that I showed off recently, especially on the side. This face has so much character. Like you compare these faces, they're clearly the same general concept, but so different. Like this one feels cheeky and happy and mischievous, whereas the other one just feels vaguely happy. I'm actually gonna take some drastic measures here because let's swap cameras. Because if we look at my paintbrushes, this paintbrush, the edges get really frayed just because they're going into like a really small element to get the glue. And I'm just going to snip off some bristles and see if that makes it better. These paintbrushes were incredibly cheap. I think they came with a painting set that cost £1, if that. So let's see if I can just snip off some bristles and if that makes anything better. Sweet. Okay, so straight away, let's take a close look at this. Tab 1, you pull over the leg, you glue it in place. That's it, that's the leg done. With a single tab, you've got one of the legs. Straight away you have a reference point for where the rest of the toy is going to come together. I almost wish there was a secondary slot tab on the inside of the leg here, just because it can slide a little bit forward and backwards, and that would kind of force you to only have it in the exact right position. I don't think anyone's going to particularly struggle with that, but I don't think it would hurt the template either to have another slot tab just coming off the side here. That said, it's hard. At least there's somewhere that it kind of blocks the movement. You can't push this face any further forwards because the foot's in the way. So you kind of have to have it in the correct position. The only downside from that is you can push it backwards by accident and go too far the other way, and a slot tab might help prevent that. But that said, we're 2 tabs in, we've got 2 legs, we know exactly where they are, they can't wobble out of place. We're already head and shoulders above the original Cutzilla. I should probably address the elephant in the room really quickly. I am covered in pasta sauce. I'd love to say it was because I was cooking and you know, I'm just such a passionate chef that I got everywhere, but no, I'm just a really messy eater and managed to drop most of my dinner down my front. Okay, so here's where the slot tabs come into place, tabs 5 and 6. You see there is tab 5, and it attaches to this sticking out tab on the back of the leg. It's an inverted tab, so the actual this will end up being on the outside of the toy. The tab is actually the face. And you can see behind it, the leg has a slot tab, which is why it has this strange little protrusion on the top of the leg. You can see when we put it into position, that just slides into place like that. It's quite hard to get a good angle on that. How's that? There we go. That little slot tab just slides into place. It means that we can't push the leg any further up. We can push it down, but we know which face we're lining up to. That one little slot tab. Oh, that's really nice. And that means the next face, the upper body, has nowhere to go except the correct position either. Oh, if you've got this far in the video, I'm assuming that you're quite interested in paper toys or paper engineering. So if you are into this, you should check out On the Same Page. It's the first episode's already out, and it's a discussion between a bunch of veteran paper toy designers, including Nick Knight, MCK, Marshall Alexander, and Three-Eyed Bear. So a bunch of well-known veteran paper toy designers who managed to get together before the lockdown and just discuss what it was like working together, exhibiting together, how they first got into paper toys, a bunch of really, really interesting stuff. So if you're enjoying this video, I'm pretty sure you'll enjoy that video too, so I'll link to that in the description. There we go. Now, because of the slot tabs we've already glued down, these upper faces can only travel in the correct direction and lock into place. This is really nice. This is a really, really nice toy. And the building experience is so different from the one from 11 years ago, which is what you'd expect with 11 years between the two. But it's a different world. Like, this by no means was the old Cutzilla. I wouldn't say it was difficult to make, or it was just awkward to make. And I think sometimes you can only tell how unpleasant a building process was when you can compare it to something else. And when you can compare it to this new design and how quickly and nicely and smoothly this model builds and comes together, you can really, this old design suddenly feels more than a little dated. And that's probably because it is more than a little dated. Also, the shape works so different. Like, what's interesting is this piece here, this body piece, has been easier to assemble than the old Cutzilla. However, just this body piece alone is a far more complicated shape. I always think you've done a good job as a paper toy designer if people have no idea how complex the toy is, or that it uses advanced paper engineering. If they're just like, well, it came together really quickly, so it's a simple toy, and you know that it's actually got all these very clever techniques, and that the actual shape of the toy is incredibly complicated, you've done a really good job. And this is a great example of that. You can see here that was tab 11. This is the bottom face I was talking about. Because we've locked these faces in fact, let me unglue that. Oh, it's going to tear. Oh, sorry. If we unlock that, you can see all of this just kind of wiggles around. It's quite flexible. It's quite malleable. The legs, not so much, because they're locked in by these internal tabs and these slot tabs. But this back end especially, it just kind of wiggles around. Whereas once that's glued down, I'm going to need to re-glue that. Once this single tab comes down, this entire thing becomes solid and rigid. There we go. Look at that. Look how little move. There's a little bit of wiggle, but that's just the paper. You're going to have a little bit of wiggle. What a difference that single tab makes. Add a bottom that doesn't cover the whole bottom. That's a great piece of advice just in general, because you don't want to close off the bottom if you don't have to, because that way people can access the tabs much easier and it makes the building experience so much more pleasant. But if you can just add a single beam when the bottom's wiggling, it just makes it so much more solid. Okay, so that's the body done. Onto the head. This time around, the horns are textured, they're not just plain white, so they do have a fold over. Now I know I gave some advice about these tabs because originally they didn't take up all of this space. They left a little bit, but there was no point in that little bit. That little bit didn't add anything, and this way it means whoever's building it has to do one less cut on each of those tabs. And every one of those cuts takes a little bit of time and a little bit of energy and a little bit of patience. So if you can get rid of them just by optimizing these little bits here and there, it can make a big difference. This back head is held together with 2 different tabs marked 3, because I guess you glue them down at the same time, which makes perfect sense. Personally, I try not to number each tab at the same thing, because my concern is one will glue down tab 3, and then in their head it'll go, well, I'm on to tab 4 now, and they won't glue down the second tab 3 if they don't notice it. But that's just a personal preference. Tab 5 is an inverted tab and glues down onto the face below it, and then the back of that tab lines up with where the body is going to attach to the head, which I'm hoping will give a slight ledge just to connect the 2 pieces, which will be really nice. Again, like in older toys, you wouldn't see something as mundane as this tab being an inverted tab. It just wouldn't have even been thought about. And it's really nice to see that done now, and I'm hoping, as I've said, this signals that this is the new normal. This is the new basic thought process, that when people are putting together a toy in their head, they're like, well, that would be an inverted tab. Maybe in their head they wouldn't even think that sentence, because that would just be, well, I'll put the tab on the outside because it's easier to access. Because it makes such a difference. If that was an internal tab, I would have had to push that in, close this whole face up, and then try to get all the way down to the bottom to glue it. I don't think anything's lost by having an external tab. Sometimes they can look a little ugly, I'll admit that. I admit there's a personal preference there in terms of aesthetics. But I don't think they hurt the design. Now, this face here, this internal face, is going to fold into the design, although you can see here it's kind of, it can't just pop in. I've got to kind of manipulate it in, so perhaps the tab ordering is less than ideal. That said, that wasn't exactly a chore to get it in there. Although, oh no, we've actually closed ourselves off. Tab 6, we can't apply any pressure to the back of the tab. Oh no. I'm trying to think how we could have worked around that. And from a design perspective, we could have made those tabs external, but I do think that would have impacted the look of the front of the face. Perhaps instead of having tab 6 here, we could have had a tab that attached backwards to the top of this mouthpiece, up at the top here. Oh, that is a really awkward fit though. I'm trying to think how we could have avoided that. Yeah. So far, the only hiccup I've encountered is these tab 6. There's 2 tabs marked 6, and I'm struggling to get them to stick. Because we put the glue on, then we kind of have to weirdly manipulate this section to push it in, and then there's just no way to apply any pressure to the back of these tabs. So we just kind of have to hold the front and hope that they stick down. Oh, that's a shame. But then tabs 7 and 8 are flipped tabs, even though they're not even necessarily needed, because we can still access the back of these tabs now that this section is open. You can see in the original this section is closed off, so they would need to be inverted. However, on this design they don't need to be inverted anymore. I know in an earlier draft of the design this was closed off, which is probably why these are inversed tabs, but they don't actually need to be anymore. I don't think that we're losing anything by them being inverted tabs. I'm just happy that there are inverted tabs at all, if I'm honest. But it's just interesting that these tabs didn't necessarily need to be. Okay, now we have to attach the head to the body, and it's just 2 blocks that push next to each other. However, this external tab here meets at the back there and helps line it up a little bit. It does add a bit of pressure. But that said, are they the same shape? Because when I'm lining these up, I have some white elements poking out. Are these the same shape? I'm assuming they are. Let's just try and glue them together. This is what I was talking about earlier, where it can be a little awkward. Just gluing 2 blocks together. Because if there's any warping, it's going to slip and slide. Whereas if it was an open tab system, you might not have these issues. Okay. Yeah, I think what's happened here is that the white face on the bottom of the head is backwards. And that's why I'm struggling to cover it up perfectly. I think it might be flipped the wrong way around, so that the front is facing this way. It's a teeny tiny issue, and for all I know I might be mistaken, because it's hard to tell now that I've glued it in place, but I think that's what might be causing an issue. Okay. Oh, this design is so charming. Okay, the last thing we have to do is put together this little butterfly and attach it to the top of the head. So I'm going to glue it in place before I cut off this bottom piece, just so that way it's easier to align everything. I'll just neaten that up with a pair of scissors. Here's the most controversial part, I would say, of this design. This butterfly glues along this folded edge onto the nose, which is difficult to do. It's difficult to balance, and there's no mark indicating where to do it. Although I'm glad there isn't a mark to do it, because I think some people might want to leave the butterfly off. See, I've already got glue kind of everywhere doing this. What can I do? I could... There we go, I'll wipe it off using this. And just glue that on like so. There we go. Oh, it's tipping. There we go. Now I'm just going to try and hold it whilst this glue dries, so that it dries at a nice angle, so it looks like the butterfly isn't dead. Oh no, I pushed it too far. I would say this is the strangest part of this design. Oh no, the butterfly's fallen over, it's left a weird... Oh, I've smeared it. You can see the inks run from the glue, and it looks like the butterfly's bleeding everywhere. This isn't necessarily a reflection on the design, this is just a reflection on my ability to attach the butterfly to the head. Oh, just stay where you are, why are you even moving? Okay, the butterfly has left a little blood splatter where it was. I still don't think it's glued in place. Oh, there we go. Okay, I'll let that dry. The ink has run off of the purple onto the green, making like a browny red. Let's see if I can get that in focus. There we go. So there's the butterfly. And there's the weird mark it left. In fact, the butterfly is slowly falling over still. Oh no. Okay, so if we were... This... I think it's no competition. This old design is old news. Get out of here. This new design is incredibly charming, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to share it with everyone today. It's just a really nice toy. Of course, I like it because I feel like a bunch of the things I've been working on have been implemented in the design. But I think even externally from myself, this is just a really, really nice design. The texture carries on these inverted tabs on the front, which is really nice. The whole thing is just charming. The way it's sat has so much character. It's just enjoying this butterfly on its head, although I will say that I did not enjoy the experience of getting these butterflies to sit on these noses. You can see I tried it twice, and both times it's kind of been pretty hit and miss. The butterfly thing didn't really work for me, but the body on this is lovely. Now, I know this was designed using 3D software, but I don't think you'd be able to tell that based on the building experience, and that's a big compliment. A lot of designs that are done using 3D software, you can tell that the paper engineering was done by a computer, not a person, because they're really awkward to put together. You can't they're not optimized for human hands to get in there. Whereas this design, I think, could have been made without 3D software, but I think it's benefited from it. Everything lines up. There's really small things here, like there's an ever so slight tilt. Oh, I'm trying to show a camera that's not on. There's an ever so slight tilt on the head. And doing that without 3D software would have been a massive pain in the butt to figure out. This is just a really nice toy. I'll put up some photos under the studio lights of this model built. It's really good. I'll put a link to where you can download your own Cutzilla in the description. And how exciting is that? That someone could design a toy 11 years ago, kind of refine their love for paper toys, and come back. This is their first toy since they've come back. And it's a great toy. And so I'm really excited to see what Luke is going to make in the future. And I'm really excited to see a bunch of things that I think improved paper toys are the new normal. Alright, that's everything I wanted to talk about today. Thank you for watching me. I'm trying to think if I have any announcements. I'm working on a new Patreon exclusive toy, so I lost a lot of Patreons over the lockdown because I couldn't upload content, which I think, is perfectly acceptable. But if you would like to be a patron, let me know. Everyone seemed to really like the last video in this style where I just kind of sat and built the toy and talked about design. And so let me know if you enjoy this style of content, and if so, I'll be happy to make some more in my little Corona corner. Thank you so much, and have a nice day. Goodbye.